At 7:42 on the morning of August 17, 1943, Technical Sergeant James McKenna knelt under the wing of a P-38 Lightning at Dobodura Airfield, New Guinea, running his hand along an aileron cable he already knew was going to get Lieutenant Robert Hayes killed. Hayes was 23, a farm kid from Iowa with 6 missions and no kills to his name, about to fly straight into 18 Japanese fighters climbing to intercept the morning patrol. McKenna had spent 8 months keeping P-38s in the air and had learned every quirk the aircraft owned. It was fast in a straight line and murderous at altitude, but it turned like a truck compared to a Zero, which could complete a full horizontal circle in half the time. Standard doctrine handled that weakness with one rule, repeated in every briefing: dive, shoot, and climb away before the fight becomes a turning contest you can't win. Hayes had followed that rule for 5 straight missions and come home each time with an empty gun camera. The 5th Air Force had lost 37 Lightnings in 6 weeks, most of them caught turning when they should have been running. The training manuals blamed the pilots. McKenna blamed the cables. The P-38's ailerons were worked by wire running the length of the twin booms through a chain of pulleys, and factory spec allowed roughly 3/8 of an inch of play in that line. At cruising speed, the slack meant nothing. In a hard defensive break at low speed, it meant a heartbeat of dead air between the stick moving and the wing responding. Just long enough for a Zero pilot who'd flown this fight 100 times to read the delay and put his rounds exactly where the American plane was about to be, rather than where it already was. McKenna had raised it with the engineering officer 2 months back and been told the tolerance was factory approved, that touching it voided the airframe certification, and that fixing flight controls required sign-off from Lockheed engineers 7,000 miles away in California. He'd watched Lieutenant David Chen come home in July with 3 bullet holes stitched in a group tight enough to prove the Zero pilot had led him perfectly, a shot that only worked if Chen's roll had lagged behind his own hands. 3 weeks later, Chen died flying a different aircraft over Rabaul, caught the same way. He'd watched Captain William Morrison, 11 kills and sharp enough to know exactly what a P-38 could and couldn't do, call his own controls mushy over the radio seconds before 2 Zeros put him into the water off Oro Bay. Morrison's crew chief tore the wreck apart afterward looking for a mechanical fault and found nothing outside spec, which told McKenna nothing was wrong on paper and everything was wrong in the air. By mid-August, he'd signed off on 17 dead men's maintenance logs and watched every surviving pilot describe the identical sensation, a plane that felt like it was thinking before it moved. The worst of them was Thomas Parker, 21, Hayes' own wingman, who went down on August 14th with 2 Zeros glued to his tail through every reversal he tried. Hayes heard it happen over the radio, Parker's voice climbing toward panic, the words, "It's not turning fast enough." Then gunfire, then a scream, then dead air. McKenna had serviced Parker's aircraft that same morning and found it perfect by every measured standard the Army recognized. Perfect and dead were not supposed to sit in the same sentence, and McKenna had run out of patience for pretending they could. On the evening of the 16th, Hayes found him in the maintenance shed and asked straight out if there was anything at all McKenna could do to make the airplane turn faster. Regulations be damned. He just wanted a fighting chance in the morning. McKenna told him to come back at dawn. He worked alone after the hangar emptied out near 11, the only light a hand lamp swinging shadows across the boom interior. He'd salvaged a 6-inch length of high-tensile piano wire off a wrecked Lightning 2 weeks earlier, without knowing why he'd kept it. Now he knew. He bent it into a Z on the hangar floor, cut his thumb doing it, wiped the blood off on his coveralls, and spent close to an hour wedged half inside Hayes' left boom, disconnecting the pulley junction, dropping the clevis pin once, and hunting for it blind in the dark for 5 long minutes, with his heart hammering the whole time. When he finally seated the wire in line with the cable and pulled it taut by hand, the slack was gone completely. The control surface answered the instant he moved it. He walked out of the hangar at 01:15, having just voided a federal maintenance manual, installed a part with no engineering approval, and made himself personally responsible for whatever happened to Hayes in the morning. He didn't sleep. At 0630, he watched the crew fuel and arm the aircraft, watched Hayes climb into the cockpit without knowing anything had changed, and at 0742, watched the Lightning lift off and vanish northwest with 16 others toward Japanese airspace. Then, there was nothing left to do but wait. The fight opened at 0814 over the Huon Gulf. 18 zeros against Hayes's flight of 4. Sun, at the Americans' backs for the dive. Hayes rolled in on a straggler at the rear of the formation, built speed past 380 miles an hour, and fired a burst that sparked off the Zero's wing without finishing the job. The Japanese pilot snapped into a hard roll and dove to escape, and Hayes rolled to chase him on pure reflex, and felt something he had never once felt in this airplane. The stick moved, and the wing answered in the same instant. No lag, no drag through the turn, as if the machine had been waiting all along for permission to fly the way it was built to. He rolled 90 degrees, in what felt like half the time it should have taken, got his sights back on the fleeing Zero, and fired again. The fighter came apart from tail to cockpit and went down trailing black smoke. There was no time to feel it. 3 more Zeros were already diving on him from above, wanting revenge for their comrade, and every rule Hayes had ever been taught said climb and run. He broke the rule instead, rolled hard into the dive to meet them, and the Lightning answered that command exactly as fast as the last one, snapping around like an aircraft that had shed half its weight overnight. The lead Zero hadn't expected the reversal and was caught turning the wrong way when Hayes put a burst through its wing root. The wing folded. 2 kills in 30 seconds. The remaining pair tried to scissor him into an overshoot, alternating turns to force a mistake, and found instead that every reversal they threw at him, the American matched instantly, stride for stride, until one of them bled too much speed correcting and gave Hayes a shot from 200 feet that he could not miss. 3 kills, 7 minutes, and a 4th Zero that broke off and ran, rather than find out what the 4th encounter would cost. Hayes landed at 0903, shaking too hard to unbuckle his own harness, walked straight to McKenna on the flight line, and said 2 words. It worked. 6 other pilots had watched the whole engagement from altitude without understanding what they were seeing. Captain Frank Mitchell, a flight leader who knew every man in the squadron and their limits by heart, had watched Hayes's Lightning roll faster than any P-38 he'd ever flown or flown against, and he wanted an answer before the debrief was finished. Hayes pointed him at McKenna. McKenna laid it out plainly. The wire, the tensioner, the 8 minutes, and the violated regulation. And Mitchell, who'd buried 4 pilots from his own flight in the last month to exactly the maneuver McKenna had just defeated, didn't hesitate. He wanted the same modification on his own aircraft that night. Consequences later. By the 20th, McKenna had wired 9 Lightnings. The fix spread the way real fixes always do in a war zone. Mechanic to mechanic, whispered rather than logged. 6-inch wires cut and bent behind closed hangar doors with nothing written down anywhere an inspector might read it. Crew chiefs pulled the tensioners out before formal inspections and put them back the moment the inspectors left. Hayes killed 2 more Zeros on the 22nd. Mitchell got 3 on the 25th. By early September, the modification had reached the 49th Fighter Group at Guisap through word of mouth alone, and roughly 40 Lightnings across New Guinea were flying with an unauthorized piece of piano wire holding their aileron cables true. The numbers turned before anyone in a position to notice figured out why. American squadrons had been losing 2 P-38s for every Zero they killed through July. By September, the ratio had nearly equalized, and Japanese pilots were the ones reporting that something had gone wrong with an enemy they thought they understood completely. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, a 64-kill ace who'd been fighting Americans since Pearl Harbor, tried his standard trick against a Lightning on September 3rd. Draw the turn, wait for the roll, snap back inside the American's radius before he could recover, and nearly collided head-on with an aircraft that reversed exactly as fast as he did. He dove away confused, and he wasn't the only veteran pilot filing a report that made no sense against wreckage, that showed nothing had physically changed. The engines matched, The guns matched. The airframes looked identical to every Lightning the Japanese had studied for a year, because the only thing different was buried inside the boom where no post-crash inspection thought to look. By the end of September the 11th, Air Fleet had lost 38 fighters to P-38s, against 22 American losses, the first sustained kill ratio in the Pacific War that favored the Lightning outright. Japanese command started ordering pilots to avoid engaging P-38s without a heavy numerical edge, a standing order that effectively conceded the turning fight the Zero had owned since 1941. Official recognition came slower than the kill count did. An inspector at Dobodura flagged inconsistent cable tension readings that October, traced the pattern to salvaged piano wire nobody had authorized, and kicked a report up a chain of command that sat on it for 3 weeks, trying to decide whether to court-martial the mechanics responsible or quietly bless what was already saving lives. Lockheed sent engineers out in November, tested the modification under real load, and confirmed what 40 crew chiefs already knew from watching their pilots come home. The tensioning fix went into the P-38J when it entered production that December, folded into the airframe as a design refinement, credited to nobody, with McKenna's name appearing in exactly 0 pages of the official record. Hayes flew 63 missions and finished the war with 11 confirmed kills, went home to Iowa, married the girl he'd left behind, and raised 4 children. Every August 17th for the rest of McKenna's life, the phone rang with Hayes on the other end, saying thank you. Mitchell made squadron commander, flew through the Philippines campaign, and retired a colonel in 1963, still telling young maintenance officers that the fix that changed the air war over New Guinea came from a sergeant with grease under his nails, not an engineer with a slide rule. McKenna went home to Long Beach in 1946, opened a garage, and spent 42 years fixing cars instead of fighters. When people asked about the war, he told them he'd been a mechanic, which was true, and told them nothing. In 1991, a historian tracking down the origin of the P-38J's cable design found references to an unauthorized wire tensioner buried in old maintenance logs from Dobodura, and eventually located McKenna, 73 by then, and still working part-time under the hood of somebody's truck. He confirmed the whole story in about 4 sentences, and shrugged off the historian's estimate that the fix had likely saved between 80 and 100 American pilots. He said he'd never kept count. He remembered the ones who came home, and that was enough for him. James McKenna died in 2006 at 88. His obituary called him an aircraft mechanic from the war and left it there. No mention of the wire, the 1,100-mile chain of custody it created between a wrecked airframe's rudder trim and a live pilot's survival, or the fact that a piece of piano wire he bent by hand on a hangar floor quietly rewrote how the entire Pacific Air War got fought. His old shop in Long Beach still stands under a different name. Somewhere in the back office, a photograph nobody's taken down shows a young man in coveralls standing beside a P-38, dated August 1943, New Guinea, and telling anyone who bothers to ask exactly the story that never made it into any Army report. If this one hit you the way it hit us, drop a like. It's the fastest way to get YouTube to put these stories in front of more people who'd want to hear them. Subscribe and turn the bell on, because we're digging one of these out of the archive every single week. Tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. This audience runs from one coast to the other, and halfway around the world besides. And if anyone in your family flew or wrenched on these machines, we want to hear that too. Thanks for watching, and thanks for making sure a name like James McKenna doesn't get left in a filing cabinet.